Senator, can you tell us, to the best of your estimation, what's going to happen on your committee, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, over these next few weeks? I am assuming that we will get President Trump announcing a nominee very quickly. We know the list that he says he will choose from of those nominees. He's made public lists of the people he said he will consider. What do you think will then happen? It's a Republican-controlled committee. Senator Graham is the chairman. He has said in the past that if an opening came up in the last year of President Trump's term, quote, we will wait till the next election. Do you believe he will keep his word about that? Do you have expectations in terms of how this is going to play out?
Well, I don't have many expectations right now. There's obviously, as you can imagine, amongst me and my colleagues, a lot of conversations and talk, and I think that's going to continue through the hours into the weekend. But I want to just pause for a second about what you say about Lindsey Graham. There are a lot of senators that went to the floor during the Merrick Garland, I'll call it a controversy because it really was, and made very firm statements about the timing of the election. And they were unequivocal, and they were very plain. And I think that this is going to be one of the great integrity checks of whether people's word, honor, and integrity really is going to be steadfast. Now, I have no illusions. I'm not so starry-eyed that not to believe that this is a rough world of politics. But I do believe that many of my Republican colleagues, should they go against what they said 4 years ago, they will not only do damage to their own sense of honor, but I think they're going to do further damage to the institution in and of itself. And so I don't know how this is going to roll, but if we cross that hurdle first with people like Lindsey Graham going against what they said 4 years ago and others who came to the floor and made plain statements, I think that we are going to go into unfortunately, another dark road. And I can't be sure how it all will play out.
One of the reasons I wanted to speak with you, Senator Booker, is because I feel like you have a curiosity and interest and devotion to making sure that moral considerations are not only part of what everybody keeps to themselves about their political decision-making, but moral considerations are discussed and moral considerations are put forward and kept in the argument so that we know that we're talking about things that have value and that aren't just about power. Senator McConnell has said gleefully before the passing of Justice Ginsburg that, of course, if there was a vacancy while President Trump was in office, even if it was, 5 minutes before the election, of course he would fill it. He's been publicly gleeful and has actually even raised funds on the basis of the fact that he would be rankly hypocritical in his approach to a Supreme Court vacancy with a Republican president in office versus a Democratic president in office. And that sort of excitement about it, that sort of glee in putting forward that it is about power and nothing else, that there is no principle at work, that I will do what is necessary to maximize my party's power no matter what. And anybody who falls for any idea of a principled decision about these things is a sucker who I will gleefully take advantage of. That performative power politics and sort of the rule of might makes right is something that I feel like we're living through now in Republican politics and in the Trump era. It's also something that I don't feel like I have very much clarity at all as to what's the best tactical way to fight back against it and to what's the moral way to fight back against it. I mean, do Democrats such as yourself on the Judiciary Committee stick to your principles and do what's right and be institutionalists and think about the Constitution and think about the country and get taken advantage of because of it when they're playing pure power on the other side? How do you defend against the kind of politics you're up against if it really is just about seizing control?
Well, I think you started the right way. This has been an era where I've had a difficult time struggling with the degree to which Donald Trump's presidency has been moral violation after moral violation. Things that my Republican colleagues, many of them have had conversations in private, and that they've been disgusted with the things that this president has done to institutions, his attacks on law enforcement, his attacks on the FBI, his attacks on the intelligence community. This has been a moral moment from its very beginning. And I know people might have used rank power to try to win sort of their interest gains and stay loyal to the president, all in the guise of that. But we are in a moral moment in America. And I think that this is a moment where we're going to all be tested in how we choose to respond. So I know there will be a lot of attention, rightfully, on Senate Democrats. There'll be people talking about what are the tactics or levers we have at all. I heard Hillary Clinton rightfully talk at the beginning of the show about whatever procedural techniques we have, tactics we have. But I also want to tell you, when they wanted to pull away the Affordable Care Act, it wasn't just Senate Democrats trying to figure out ways to protect health care for millions of Americans. It was America that showed up in a way that was so significant. And I'm hoping that this is a moment where America shows up. Regardless of what your political persuasion is, there is a clear way to go to honor how we set up the traditions under Merrick Garland, that if they're violated now with all that's at stake, I'm hoping people will speak out. That's why the Supreme Court before me that you're showing, with so many Americans spontaneously coming out, gives me hope that this will be one of those times that even if Republicans want to do the wrong thing, that there will be enough people that have a sense of shame, enough people that have a sense of honor, that they will stand up and speak up and prevent them from thrusting the Senate further into a sort of an era of delegitimization, but from yanking and pulling the Supreme Court down further in the eyes of many Americans in terms of being an illegitimate institution that has been overcome by power politics. Ruth Bader Ginsburg lived to make that a moral institution that, based on the sacrosanct ideals of this nation, ideals of human rights and civil rights. And I'm hoping at this time of her passing, we all can rise to her level of honor and stand upon those principles and show our commitment to them.
Senator Cory Booker, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thanks for being here tonight, Senator. I know it's Friday night, it's a late night, and this is a difficult time, but it's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, always.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.